In this lesson, we're going to spend some time talking about the philosophy of John Rawls as part of our broader conversation on the subject of liberalism for AQA A-level political ideas. Now, we're going to focus on what the specification tells us, which is that we need to know about John Rawls' concept of justice and his principles of justice. Now, this leaves relatively wide open what we could talk about. So we're going to specifically talk about the concept of justice as fairness, John Rawls' original position and the veil of ignorance. We'll talk about the two principles of justice, the difference principle, and we'll think about some criticisms specifically that were associated with his later writings, and then think about how he responded to some of these criticisms in the future. So, John Rawls is one of the most influential liberal political philosophers of the 20th century. His theory of justice as fairness is probably the most groundbreaking of the 20th century in terms of political philosophy, at least in my view anyway. He laid out a lot of his work in his first book, Theory of Justice, from 1971, and then he builds on that with a number of other books, such as Political Liberalism, as well as The Law of Peoples, which is a theory of international justice, a sort of internationalization of his theory of justice. And within the theory of justice, he presents something known as the concept of justice as fairness. Now, at the core of Rawlsian political philosophy is this idea that justice should be viewed as basically fairness. The idea here, the meaning of this, is that principles of justice should essentially just ensure that all individuals, regardless of their social position, should be treated equally and they should be treated fairly. With this in mind, then, Rawls emphasizes that societal structures should be designed in ways that protect the rights of individuals and that also support equitable opportunities, especially for those who are least advantaged. This is a theory which contrasts with the traditional understanding of utilitarianism, something that we discussed in the previous lesson looking at John Stuart Mill. Now, according to utilitarianism, the best action is the one which maximizes overall happiness or overall utility. And while utilitarianism aims to maximize total welfare, Rawls in fact argues that justice should be about fairness and protecting the basic liberties of all individuals. And so in this sense, justice isn't about maximizing the total good, but it is instead about ensuring that each person's fundamental rights are to be respected and that individual inequalities are structured in ways that benefit the least advantaged. He sets out his sort of achievement of justice as fairness in his original position. Now, to derive the principles of justice, Rawls introduces the original position as a thought experiment. So the original position is a hypothetical situation in which all individuals come together to decide on the rules that should be associated with a just society. Now, according to this scenario, people are put behind what is known as a veil of ignorance. Essentially, people are made unaware of their own characteristics. So they are made unaware of their gender, of their race, of their socioeconomic status, of their talents, of what they're good at, their skills. And what the veil of ignorance does is ensures that decisions that are made about justice are made as impartially as possible, so that individuals cannot favour their own particular interest or their own position within a society. So they are placed behind a veil of ignorance. They have no idea what they are, who they are, what kind of characteristics they have, and that they are asked by Rawls to design the principles that could be fair to everyone. Because they don't know whether or not they'll be born into an advantaged or a disadvantaged position because they are behind a veil of ignorance, then according to Rawls, this is going to be the most reflective of the most basic principles of justice. Essentially, his argument being that people who are disadvantaged and that they know that they're disadvantaged are going to want to have principles of justice that provide more than would be necessary for them as a disadvantaged person, whereas people who are advantaged would want to provide as little as possible as that. But if you're completely unaware of where you're going to be, you're going to want to hedge your bets, basically, and you're going to want to position yourself in a way that puts you in a society that would be ideal for everybody. Now, the original position is meant to reflect a condition of equality where individuals would choose principles of justice that they believe everybody would agree to, assuming they could be anyone in a society. Not knowing their own eventual status, they're going to want to be living in a society that is beneficial to everybody, just in case they find themselves in a position they did not realize that they were going to be in. This is the thought experiment that associates with the basic principles of justice as fairness. Now, Rawls argues that individuals in the original position would ultimately choose two principles of justice. The first principle is known as the basic equal liberties principle. This is the emphasis on the protection of equal basic liberties for all individuals. And these will include things like freedom of speech, the right to vote, freedom of assembly, the right to personal security. And according to Rawls, these are all liberties that are non-negotiable and that they must be guaranteed for everybody involved, as they form the foundation of a just society. This principle is lexically prior to the second principle. And what this means is that basic liberties cannot be sacrificed or compromised for the sake of any kind of social or economic advantage. So if there is an advantage that is had to having a limitation on the right to personal security, this cannot ever be a line that a state would cross or a society would cross. The second principle of justice concerns and addresses the distribution of wealth and resources within society, and it consists of two main strands, two main aspects. The first of these is the difference principle. The difference principle tells us that social and economic inequalities are justified only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. So, in other words, any inequality that exists in wealth or opportunities should be arranged so that they improve the conditions of the worst off members. This is a principle that is central to the view of justice because it seeks to ensure that inequalities don't work to the detriment of the most vulnerable members of society. And it makes sense that in a veil of ignorance, in an original position, that people would come up with this idea, because if, let's say, we're in a veil of ignorance, we don't know what our own social or political or whatever characteristics are. If somebody raises the question of inequalities, then we would all naturally agree that, well, inequalities can, if they are to be justified, it should not be to disadvantage the most vulnerable members of our society. And that's what the difference principle tells us. The second principle of the second principle is that there is a principle of the fair equality of opportunity. What this principle does is hold that positions and offices should be open to all individuals based on their abilities and their efforts, not their social background or any other kind of arbitrary factors that are completely irrelevant. If people should therefore have the equal chance to succeed, irrespective of their family background, their race, their class, their institutions, all of which should be designed to promote the fairness in terms of the equality of opportunity. Now, Rawls asserts that the principles of justice do indeed have a lexical ordering. So the first principle, the equal basic liberties principle, does have priority over the second principle. Within the second principle, the first part has priority over the second part. So essentially, in the way I've structured it here, the actual way in which it is ordered is that the equality of opportunity principle is listed first in the second principle of justice. So The way it would be ordered is at the top, in order of priority, is number one, the first principle of justice, equal basic liberties. Number two, in the second principle of justice, would be the fair equality of opportunity. That is the second principle. And then finally, the difference principle, which is essentially that if you will have any kind of inequalities, that's okay, so long as they are able to advantage the least advantaged in society. Okay, so in other words, basic liberties are the most important. They cannot be violated. Once basic liberties are secured, social and economic inequalities are permissible if they benefit the least advantaged, and only after they ensure the equal opportunities for all. Let's take a closer look then at the difference principle, because it's really, really interesting how this actually works. The difference principle is often considered the most significant aspects of Rawlsian political philosophy, because it essentially justifies and allows inequality. It allows for the inequality in the distribution of wealth and resources. But the twist, of course, the liberal twist, is that it does so only if that inequality works to the benefit of those who are worst off. And this contrasts with theories of justice that try to aim for an egalitarian society, that try to aim for a maximum and complete equality. Rawls suggests that economic disparities should not be eliminated outright, but they should be structured in such a way that the least advantaged are better off than they would be under any kind of alternative arrangements. So let's take an example of the difference principle, or a couple of examples. If the wealthiest members of society have access to better healthcare or education, then the difference principle would allow for this, so long as such disparities lead to an overall improvement of the least well-off, such as an increased access to opportunities or resources for the poorest in society. What are the critiques then? What are the critiques of this particular theory? Well, critiques can come from a number of different places. Firstly, the utilitarian critique is very much prevalent. So critics from this perspective argue that Rawls's emphasis on fairness may lead to inefficiencies or a failure to maximize total social welfare. They contend that the focus on the least advantaged may also have the disadvantage of impeding overall prosperity. That is one critique of Rawls from the utilitarian perspective. The libertarian critique, people like Robert Nozick, who wrote Anarchy, State and Utopia, argue that Rawls's theory is incompatible with individual liberty and is incompatible with property rights, particularly due to the acceptance that redistributive taxation is required to address inequalities. And then finally, you have the feminist critique. A number of feminists, like I believe Susan Okin, argues that Rawls's theory does not adequately address issues of gender inequality. Essentially, the matters that are considered to be inside the theory of justice do not include things that would be of feminist considerations, like marriage and issues like that. And so these are things that Rawls doesn't really address in the theory of justice, but he does still address in his later work, in his work Political Liberalism, which was written in 1993. He does address the idea of justice as fairness, and he does address the issue of pluralism, and the reality that in a democratic society, individuals hold many different comprehensive doctrines. And within political liberalism, Rawls suggests that a just society must respect the idea of pluralism and find ways to work out a common political principle that is endorsed by all. So as an overall conclusion then, Rawls is one of the most important of the modern liberal political philosophers. His theory of justice is firstly a significant departure from utilitarianism as well as from traditional theories of justice. But it is also particularly groundbreaking in a way that it understands and in the way that it conceptualizes the problems of a society and the ways in which we should address solutions to those problems. His vision had a lasting impact on contemporary political philosophy and provided an alternative for more individualistic or utilitarian views by emphasizing fairness and the protection of the least advantaged.